How we doing? Good. I'm excited to be with you. I'm excited to continue this series on a royal priesthood and what that means here this morning. There are some unique things that aren't typically covered, and we've been trying to capture that here in this series as we kind of set up the year. And so, if you recall, a couple weeks ago, we came out and we just kind of laid this picture of what it means, like a high overview of what it means to be a royal priesthood. And really, we kind of lay this picture as being royal is to be made in the image of God, to be patterned after the king, and to be a priest is kind of to be in the service of God. But the royal priesthood is this unique piece of, if you think of God up here and mankind and creation down here, that a royal priest is the person that kind of stands in between and is almost a mirror that reflects both directions. So it reflects the goodness and grandeur of God to creation, and then it reflects the praises of creation back up to God. You guys with me? This is a critical piece that I think we so often forget in terms of what it means to be a follower of Jesus, what it means to be created in the image of God. And so now we've been breaking that down a little bit further, and Daniel came up last week, and he captured the first half of what it means to be royal. And he talked about what it means to be royal in terms of our identity. That being made in the image of God shapes who we are just in our very core, in our being. And how each and every person is royal, is a child of the king, is a prince or a princess. And that's a critical piece just to understanding who we are. So often we think that maybe we're worthless, maybe we don't have value. You have those dark moments where you're wondering, like, do I have any worth? Why do people like me? Why does God care about me? And so it's so important for us to understand that we are made in the image of the king, men and women, not just in a male king, but in a king that captures the fullness. And men and women are both created in that image and have that value and benefit of being royal. There's a second part of that we want to capture today, a second part of being royal. But before we even go into that, I want to go a little deeper into something I introduced a couple weeks ago, which was that in the ancient Near East, which is like both a time period and a region. So the time period really when the Bible was written down, more or less, give or take hundreds of years, there's this period where we're talking about the Near East, and it's way back when. I won't put a time period to it, but think this is when Moses was alive, and before and after that kind of broader time period. And in that period, there were kings that came about, and the kings couldn't be everywhere. Now, it may seem insane to some of us, but this is pre-internet. This is pre-cell phones. This is pre-phones. There was no postal service even that could send something in a rapid period of time. And so a king would have this big dominion, but they would need to represent themselves across their dominion. So how do they do that, especially if they conquer a foreign land or something? How do they leave a representative in this foreign land so that those people know that they shouldn't go against the king? So those people know who their king is and who they report to, what the laws are, and what that means for their identity as a people. So how do you do that without being able to send an email reminder or a video clip or to pick up the phone and say, hey, you're my guy, you're my girl? How did they do that? They would set up statues made in the likeness of the king. So let's do this exercise right now and imagine that I'm the king. That sounds like a fun exercise to me. Man, things would be great, wouldn't it? Don't answer that. This is for me to answer. That's a rhetorical question. Yes, they would be great if Scott were king. Now, suppose I'm king. What do I need to do then? I need to set up a representation of myself. We have props here today. So typically this would be made of stone or wood, and it would be made in the likeness of the king. And so, if I were king, you guys can see this beautiful drawing right here. There we go. I would put this in one region. He's going to stay up. Is it good drawing of the beard? Oops, just lost that one. But I don't want just one representation because I have multiple regions. So I need to set up others. Sorry, I only have one tall one. But say I have a region over here. There's Scott over there as well. What's that? All right, and let's go ahead and set up a third one because my reign, my kingdom is large. So let's set one up over here as well. All right. Now, it's not just made in my likeness, it's made in my form and my likeness. And so these drawings aren't as good. But if we really want it to be representative of me, there's going to be a taco in his hand. That's his hand right there, in case you didn't know. Hey, you know what? Yeah, this was a quick drawing. All right, so I'm the king, and in region 1, I put my form and likeness over here. In region 2, I put my form and likeness over here. And in region 3, I put my form and likeness over there. Now, you can probably see the flaw in this plan, right? All right, if I live in this region, what if I just come and like hide behind this thing over here? And the king can't quite see me, can he? In fact, I can probably do whatever I want in front of the statue of the king. And guess what? The actual king is not going to find out, is he? Moreover, say I want to talk to the king. Hello. Did you guys hear a response? No. Even in this one, hello. Maybe I get a little bit of an echo, but he's not really responding to me. This is a huge flaw in the plan of the king being represented across the region, is it not? Now, say I even want to frustrate the king. What's he going to do? What's he going to do? Nothing. And so, this plan of using statues to represent yourself is a flawed plan. It doesn't quite work. Now, he might look good, not as good as the actual king, but at the end of the day, am I really getting a true representation of the king? No. And so, when the Bible got written down, in fact, when it was oral even before this, partly they wanted to show that the differences between their culture and what the culture of God's people was. And so one of the things that is very clear in Genesis 1 is that God created man in his form and likeness. In the same way that a statue was created in the form and likeness of the king, God created men and women in his form and likeness. Now, there's a massive difference here alone, is that yes, similarities of form and likeness, but what God did is he actually formed the man and the woman. They were living beings that could move. And so, say this representative here wants to move, it can take a step over. I can move around as a man or a woman, as a representative of the king. All of a sudden, we have mobile statues that are moving about. There's not just one place or 3 places or however many places we can build, but there are people that populate the earth that now are walking around mobile representations of the king. Moreover, instead of just being a hollow representation of the king, what God did is that he breathed the breath of life into his representatives. This is not some dead piece of cardboard or stone or wood, but it is a living, breathing being that is made in the image of God that carries his very life breath inside of them. And you can see all of a sudden that there is a massive difference between what happened in the culture of the time and what God did amongst his people. Now, it's not that God did it in response to what was happening because he had done this in advance, but he is clarifying this stands up and against what was happening then. Are you guys with me so far? And so instead of just having something that can get blown over by the wind, something that can't hear, something that can't see, something that can't move, something that can't breathe, God populates the earth with living, mobile, seeing, hearing, feeling, tasting with the tacos, and breathing beings that carried about his work around the region. Now, this isn't just something that belonged in the Old Testament, but this is something that carries on. This is who God created his people to be. All people, not just the first people, not the second generation of people, not just the Israelites in the ancient Near East, but all people, all humans created in this image, created for this purpose. So last week, Daniel talked about our identity as being royal. But beyond the identity is that there is a role, a purpose to being created in the image of the King. So being royal isn't just about who you are, but who you are leads then into what you do, into your role. So when God made man and woman to be royal, that wasn't just so that they could sit in their high tower and eat grapes and drink wine and watch Netflix all day. It was so that they could then carry out and represent the King, carry out his purposes. So we're going to go deeper into that here this morning. But we're not just going to look at the Old Testament. We're going to look at how this even carries more meaning in the New Testament. And so we're going to jump into 2 Corinthians chapter 5. And here's what it says. Starting in verse 16. From now on, therefore, we regard no one from a human point of view. Even though we once knew Christ from a human point of view, we know him no longer in that way. He says this, so if anyone is in Christ, there is a new creation. Everything old has passed away. Everything has become new. All this from God, who reconciled to himself through Christ and has given us the ministry of reconciliation. That is, in Christ, God was reconciling the world to himself, not counting their trespasses against them, and entrusting the message of reconciliation to us. So we are ambassadors for Christ. Since God is making his appeal through us, we entreat you on behalf of Christ, be reconciled to God. Now, there's a lot in this passage, and we're going to kind of focus in on a few verses. But I want to make one other thing clear in the context of this. Is earlier in chapter 5, Paul is talking about how we are in earthly tents. Do you guys remember what we talked about 2 weeks ago? What did a tent represent? A tent represented the tabernacle. The tabernacle was the mobile temple where the priest dwelled, right? And so when Jesus came, John says, in the Gospel of John, he says that Jesus came and tabernacled, tented among us. Jesus came and was a mobile temple amongst the people. And then we were then called to be priests in those temples, and that our bodies, are temples. And so he says here that we have an earthly tent and a house not made with hands. In Hebrew, the same word that means house means temple. Veit. So we might call it a tent, we might call it a tabernacle, we might call it a house, or we might call it a temple, but this is the place where God dwells. So this is in the context of what Paul is talking about. He's talking about temples, mobile temples, and how we are these places. And so then when there's a new creation, we are created newly so that we might represent God amongst the people. I know that's kind of a lot, but are you guys with me? So then later we pick up, and we're just going to focus in on a couple pieces from in here. So he says in verse 18, he's talking about God. He says, who reconciled us to himself through Christ. He's talking about how Christ has this work of reconciling humans to God. There is this role that Jesus played where he stood between man and God, and he helped bring people back to God. But he doesn't end there, and he says, and has given us the ministry of reconciliation. So to be a follower of Jesus doesn't mean that we were the ones that got reconciled back to God and that's the end of this story. But it means that we are given this ministry of reconciliation, this role of going about and telling the world about the love of God and helping people be reconciled back to him. We are representatives that go and share this message. And later it talks about the message of reconciliation. But first it talks about the ministry of reconciliation. Because it's one thing to go and announce and say, hey, Jesus did this thing for you. And it's another thing to carry about that reconciliation work where we help. We are the conduit through which God reaches and reconciles the world to himself. See the difference between the two things? One is to call it out. The other is to actually enact it. Where with Jesus working through us, but through us, the world might be reconciled to God. So we have the ministry of reconciliation. And then it says in verse 19 at the end that Jesus entrusted us the message of reconciliation. And then in verse 20, so we are ambassadors for Christ, since God is making his appeal through us. We are ambassadors for Christ. An ambassador is what? A representative. Someone that goes and represents the government, be it a king, a president, a Congress, a country, out to others. That is the role of an ambassador typically, is to go and carry a message from here and over to here. But ambassadors largely are powerless, right? They kind of like have to get the download from home base and say, this is what you're going to say. And then they go sit down with another ambassador. This is what my government says. That person says, let me go talk to my government. They go back, talk over here. Then they come back, sit down again. Well, hey, this is what my team says. Okay, well, let me go back and see if that's okay, right? And it's just kind of a middleman so often in our modern world. But as we just saw, that is not what God is talking about. To be an ambassador for Christ is to be that person through which reconciliation happens. And the reason that we can be ambassadors that actually have a purpose is because we were created in the image of God, and God instilled this purpose inside of us. Are you guys with me? So last week we talked about how we have this special value just because of our identity, just because of who we are, because of who God created each and every one of us to be. And he says, I care about you. I'm going to instill my image in you, my likeness in you. And when we come to follow Jesus, my spirit in you. And right there alone, we have value. No matter what we do, we have this new identity and value that we carry. But then out of that identity, then we have a role. Where if I am the child of the king, the prince or the princess, then I then represent that king to the world. And send that message of reconciliation. And not just the message, but I am the ambassador of reconciliation through which it actually takes place. Are you guys with me? It's really easy for us to kind of settle for looking like the king. In the fall, one of my co-workers instituted dress like Scott Day, look like Scott Day. It's my favorite day of the year. No. So a whole bunch of people wore button-down shirts like this, although I mostly wear t-shirts to work now. But this was their way of looking like Scott. And a couple of the people bought fake beards, and they put fake beards on themselves. Women, by the way, and they wore fake beards during company calls and different things over Zoom. And they looked like Scott, more or less. It's the shoes? All right. Sinooks, that's where it's at. And they could look like me. But there is one thing to kind of look like someone and just settle for that. It's a whole nother thing altogether to go and represent someone, to go and live out that role. So what they didn't do on Dress Like Scott Day is go and play my role within the company. And for many of us, we settle for dressing like the king. We kind of settle for God gives us this identity, and it feels great, and it looks great, and that's important. But that is not the end of the story. That is one key part of the story. Because once we then represent the king and look like the king in his form and likeness, then that should carry out into how we live. And so I shouldn't just look like him. I should live like him. And so if Jesus was about reconciliation, I should be about reconciliation. If Jesus was about peace and wholeness, I should be about peace and wholeness. If Jesus is about new creation, I should be about new creation. If Jesus was about caring for the sick, then I should be about caring for the sick. And not just be about it, I should care for the sick. If Jesus was about caring for the marginalized, being made in his image, I should care for the marginalized. If Jesus was the one that would go to the lost and hurting, so should I go to the lost and the hurting. Because that is who I am. And who I am should drive how I live. So when we come back to this idea of being a royal priesthood, of what it means to be royal, what it means to stand in this gap between God and creation, it's not just to be a stagnant mirror that simply reflects God, but reflects God fully in the sense that it is living that out. It's not settling for sitting over here, but it is about being everything that a statue is not. So it takes that likeness and that form, and it puts it into action, and it becomes mobile. Imagine how many statues we could erect across the globe that would represent God. Suppose we could put 1 million, even 1 billion. There's still so many places that those statues could not reach. But think about a mobile, living, breathing statue that can go to the lost, that can go to the hurting, that can go to the broken and find them wherever they are at. It's not about also being a stone or a piece of wood or a piece of cardboard or a terrible drawing that represents something. But it is about living and breathing, smelling, tasting, seeing, hearing, caring, putting an arm around, and living out what it means to have the life breath of the Creator inside of us. And what it means to be transformed, to be a new creation reconciled to God with Christ Himself dwelling in us. It's not just what happened at creation, it's also what Jesus does and continues to do in and through us. As you go about your weeks this week, it would be easy to leave your identity as a follower of Jesus in this room. We could hide this somewhere, Paulette, and then we could come back and we could pull it out next week and we could look, hey, there's my identity as a follower of Jesus. And then we could leave and then we could come back a week later and look at our identity for an hour and a half. Or we could realize that our identity doesn't live in a building. And it's not something that is just meant to be who we are, but that who we are drives how we live. And so imagine this week if we sent out 30 living, breathing, hearing, smelling, tasting, seeing, carrying statues made in the form and likeness of the Creator out into Orange County, out into Southern California. And imagine if the form and likeness that lived all of that out stepped into your workplace, stepped into your home, stepped into your coffee shop, to your favorite restaurant, into the ocean, in your car as you drive down the freeway. And imagine these living, breathing statues of the King going across Southern California with this ministry of reconciliation to help usher people back to God and let them experience the love of the Creator. That is who God created us to be. And when Jesus turns us into a new creation, he is restoring us and reinstilling that purpose inside of us. That is who you are. Now, there might be moments where you don't feel like it. There might be moments where you don't succeed at it. It doesn't change the fact that our identity is established in who God is. And that each day we have a fresh chance to live that out. Each moment we have a fresh chance to live that out. Lord God, we thank you that you create this identity in us. That there's nothing we have to do, that there's nothing that we have to earn. But that is the first step. And that you do all of the work. We thank you that you created us to be royal. Lord, in these similar kingdoms of those times when this was written down, the common people weren't royal. They were subjects, servants. We thank you that you didn't create us just to do your bidding, but that you elevated us into this high role as royal beings, royal statues, living and breathing. So God, we pray that you would help us to further walk out our identity day by day, week by week, even hour by hour, minute by minute, God. May we know who we are, know who you are, and then live in response to those things.